Indeed, this was back in a time when, we all felt that it was probably never going to happen for us. In 1998, we didn't even have inclusion in the mission statements of large organizations like the Human Rights Campaign, much less actual inclusion in any of the legislation that was being proposed. But through the perseverance and through the people who just decided we cannot take no for an answer, the grassroots spoke out. Gwen Smith, by her actions, spoke out and kept us going on an annual basis. The very following year, it went from being San Francisco to nationwide, and I was one of the organizers to help get it going nationwide in Houston. And Houston's was done with good reason as well. We were the only city in those first 8 years that had one, if not two, victims on each of those days of remembrance, except for one. 7 of those 8 years, it was a consistent pattern in Houston. We were losing community members, and we were frustrated. None of them were solved. It's far too easy for us to be written off. But people speaking out actually changed the dynamics. People like Gwen Smith, people like all the ragtag activists that got involved in the Days of Remembrance, that began this on a nationwide, and then later in a couple of years, when I got the first couple in Vancouver and in Ontario and in Santiago, Chile, it started moving internationally. Now everybody at least has the awareness of it. Many nations around the world participate currently in the Days of Remembrance. I don't have the exact number, but I know it's as far flung as in the Orient, in Latin America, where literally it's a killing field down there for the trans community. Throughout Europe, the only continent that I'm unaware of that has not had one as yet is Africa and Antarctica. But give it time. The word is spreading because people refuse to be silent. They decided to speak up and speak out. Now, I want you to know that the victims that we memorialize on our Days of Remembrance are not heroes. They're not heroes simply because they were murdered. Heroism is something more deliberate. It's an act that someone does consciously. Nobody wakes up in the morning and says, I feel like being the random victim of murder today. That said, even though they're not heroes, they're people who lived courageous lives. They lived with courage. Many of them in countries where they knew each and every day when they stepped out of that door and stepped foot on pavement that it was very likely going to be their last day. People who did it day in, day out, regardless of the violence they'd already encountered. And yet, they continued living their lives. It may not be actual speaking in the physical sense of the word, but it is indeed a manifestation of their communication to the rest of the world. I own my life. I determine who I am, and I refuse to be who you wish simply in order to keep my life and to keep you happy. Now, I mentioned that the victims are not heroes necessarily, but there have been a few who have been heroic and lost their lives, most of them in foreign countries. Unlike the U.S., where we actually have it relatively well, many countries around the world, it is still a day-to-day life struggle for individuals just to survive, even to live, even to retain their own lives in their own homes, in their own businesses. Literally, they are sought out and killed, sometimes by the authorities. And in fact, in 1999, the very first day of remembrance, I happened to pass out sheets to people, and I kept one back just randomly in order to read that name for myself. And I was actually a little bit surprised when I looked at the sheet and I saw the name Vanessa on it, and it startled me. Even her middle name was Lorena, which is the Spanish interpretation of Lorraine, again, my middle name. Her name was Vanessa Lorena Ledesma. And I read not only the sheet that night, but also read up on her later. She was one of our activists in Buenos Aires, Argentina, and devoted her life to trying to change the abject violence that happened on a daily basis with anybody in the trans community. Latin America is horrific on anybody who is GLBT, but most especially transgender, as we stick out like a sore thumb. We are visibly different. We are out each and every day. There are no closets to run into. And Vanessa, of course, understood the problem and understood that a lot of the violence they were receiving was coming from the very police forces that are in charge of upholding law. She rebelled against that. She spoke out against that. She spoke out to the media. She organized the people in Argentina to protest, to stand up against them, to speak out and speak up. And she paid with this numerous times with incarceration, until on her final incarceration, she officially suffered a heart attack. And of course, at her funeral, they got to see the body, bruised, battered, contusions, what looked like broken bones. Vanessa Lorena Ledesma paid for speaking up with her life. But that was a conscious act on her part. Now, I'm not instructing people to go out and consciously be heroes and to lose their lives. But I actually had a friend of mine that was a protege here in the U.S. by the name of Terry Ann Summers. And I got her involved in activism similarly. And unfortunately, in 2000, when Terry Ann was in the process of organizing the second Winn-Dixie protest at Winn-Dixie's headquarters in Jacksonville, 2 miles from her home. Winn-Dixie, by the way, was the supermarket chain that fired a cross-dresser by the name of Peter Euler in New Orleans. And even though she'd never met Peter Euler, she organized both of those protests in front of Winn-Dixie. And unfortunately, immediately before the second one, when she drove home, she was ambushed in her own driveway. They waited in the bushes for her. She wasn't even able to get out of her car, and they shot her dead. She lived a heroic life. She wasn't a hero because she lost her life to hatred, but she was a hero by her demonstration of speaking up and speaking out and refusing to let fear dominate her life.